Hey everyone, Ethan here. Yu-Gi-Oh has been a part of my life, and as strange as it sounds, my family for most of my life. My brother got me into it before I was even in school and used to love collecting the structure decks. My dad has been a fan since around the same time, loving the original anime and even still plays Master Duel regularly to this day. Heck, my mom, who doesn't even play games, used to play Yu-Gi the Destiny on PC pretty regularly for a while back in the day. I usually find myself getting back into it in some capacity every so often, most recently holding a very small Master Duel tournament with my close friends and family. But among all the ways to experience Yu-Gi-Oh, one of my favorites is playing Duelist of the Roses for PS2, which I've done several times since at least 2005. Also, I feel like I'm at the point where I do this in every video now, but thank you all so much for getting the Banjo video to over 250 views, making it the second most viewed video on my channel. Before I get into properly talking about the game, I first want to give a little background as to what Yu-Gi-Oh is and how it's both similar and different from Duelist of the Roses. Yu-Gi-Oh is a trading card game that has been going on for 25 years now, where you summon monster cards and activate spell and trap cards all in an attempt to reduce your opponent's life points to 0 before they do the same to you. Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses takes the basic formula of what I just mentioned but adds a few twists to make it different in a way that we haven't seen before or since. The game gets its cast of characters mostly from the first season of the original anime series, commonly referred to as Duel Monsters. These characters also have a unique spin on them, with them technically sharing the names and likeness of their anime counterparts while being completely different people. This game's story is a bit bonkers, being a Yugi-fied version of the real-life War of the Roses, which was a civil war that had two house factions fight over who was the rightful owner of England's throne. This war took place from the mid to late 1400s, which saw the House of Lancaster, or the Red Rose, trying to overthrow the House of York, which brandished the White Rose. Yugi and friends take the mantle of the Lancasters, with Yugi himself playing the role of Henry Tudor. It's really funny to me that the soon-to-be King of England is like, "My name is Henry Tudor VII, but please call me Yugi." The Yorkists are spearheaded by Seto Kaiba, with his counterpart being Christian Rosencreuz. His faction is primarily made up of antagonists from Season 1 of the show, Ishizu for some reason, and Haishin from Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories on the PS1. Still with me? Anyways, with that preliminary out of the way, the game starts with your character being summoned at Stonehenge by Simon, a druid for the Red Roses, in a desperate attempt to turn the tides of war in their favor. Before he can recruit you, however, Kaiba arrives and offers your safe return back to your timeline in exchange for taking down the Lancasters. It is here where you can make the important decision of which side you want to fight for. Depending on which rose you decide to ally with, you will be tasked with dueling members of the opposite faction and collecting all 8 of their rose cards to help your respective side to victory. At the end of your respective story, you will either face Kaiba or Yugi, but then no matter which side you pick, you'll face Mana Widen Fablair, portrayed by the Brother of Nightmare, again from the Forbidden Memories game. His deck also changes depending on which side you're fighting for. What's pretty awesome is that once you finish the story, upon loading your save, you'll be back at Stonehenge, this time now forced to side with the opposite faction than you originally chose. You even get to keep your deck and all of the cards you won along the way. Finishing this side of the story will allow you to rematch any previous opponent regardless of faction. To properly explain how this game works, it's probably best that I first talk about the features brought over either exactly or very closely from the real-life Yu-Gi-Oh card game. Duels are one-on-one, with both participants having a 40-card deck made of monster, spell, and trap cards. In this game, your deck can only be 40 cards instead of a range from 40 to 60. At the beginning of a duel, each player draws 5 cards and automatically draws until they have 5 cards at the start of their turn, unless their deck is out of cards. Unlike the card game, you do not automatically lose if you attempt to draw from an empty deck. Exclusive to this game is that a player's hand can have no more than 5 cards no matter what. Also, you can only play 1 card each turn, as opposed to being able to summon 1 monster and setting or activating as many spells and traps as you want in the real-life card game. Monster cards are your main source of doing damage by attacking the opponent's monsters or the opponent themselves. All monsters have an attack and defense point stat. Monsters use their attack stat when in attack mode, aka when they're vertical, and defense point stat when in defense mode, which is when they're horizontal. Both duelists have 4,000 life points and are trying to reduce their opponents to 0. Battles are determined by subtracting the attacking monster's attack points by the opposing monster's attack or defense points depending on their battle position. The monster with the higher stat wins the battle, and the difference is dealt to the player's life points who lost the battle. However, no life points are subtracted if the monster that lost the battle was in defense mode. Defense position monsters are destroyed if they lose the battle. However, monsters in attack position are only destroyed if they lost the battle to another monster in attack position. Destroyed cards are sent to the graveyard, which is just essentially a discard pile. Monsters can also have additional effects which can do a variety of different things. I'm leaving that purposely vague so I don't have to say "I'll explain that later" several times in a row. Normal monster cards are a yellowish color, while effect monsters are more of an orangish color. All monsters have a type and attribute assigned to them. There are 6 attributes, which are light, dark, earth, wind, fire, and water. Types are a bit more diverse and help distinguish monsters a bit more. These are Aqua, Beast, Beast Warrior, Dinosaur, Dragon, Fairy, Fiend, Fish, Insect, Machine, Plant, Pyro, Reptile, Rock, Sea Serpent, Spellcaster, Thunder, Warrior, Wing Beast, Zombie, and exclusive to this game is Immortal. What most people know as spell cards are actually called magic cards in this game, which were their original name before having to be changed due to naming similarity with the Magic the Gathering card game. This game came out before that change, although I'm just going to call them spells because that's what I'm used to. Spell cards are meant to be used proactively to apply various effects like doing direct damage to your opponent, bringing a monster back from the graveyard, and many, many more. There are also 3 subsets of spell cards that each have their own use. Equip spells are typically used to power up your monsters, field spells will change the terrain around you, and ritual spells allow you to summon special monsters. Finally, trap cards are similar to spells but are meant to be used in a more reactive way towards your opponent. Trap cards usually seek to destroy, drain, or delay your opponent in various ways. Instead of you activating them, they are instead triggered when their activation condition is met. Some trap cards have limited range, meaning that they have to be close enough to whatever triggers them, while others have unlimited range, triggering from anywhere on the board as soon as their condition is met. You can have a maximum of 5 monsters and 5 spell or traps on the field at a given time. Diving into what makes Duelist of the Roses unique, you'll immediately notice that instead of the field of play being split by each player having their own side, this game's field is a 7x7 grid that is shared by both players, with each of them starting out on the top center and bottom center of the board. Players are anchored by their deck master, an assigned monster that is capable of moving around the board, playing cards, and can be attacked for direct damage to their life points. While only 1 card can be played from the hand once per turn, every card on the field can move once per turn. Deck leaders and cards have the ability to move in any one of the 4 main cardinal directions. You can play a card in any one of the 8 adjacent tiles as long as the space isn't being occupied by an opponent's card, labyrinth terrain, or the end of the board. Cards can use their turn to move, change position, flip face up, or potentially all 3. Cards in defense mode will switch to attack mode if they're moved, however. Also exclusive to this game is face down attack mode. Every card in this game is placed face down until revealed by the player or challenged by the opponent. This game does not feature the sacrificing mechanic, so to get more powerful monsters on the field, you use your summoning power. Basically, each player starts with 4 stars and gets an additional 3 at the start of each of their turns. When summoning a monster, you spend the amount of stars that is equal to the monster's level that you summoned. So you can choose to constantly summon weaker monsters turn after turn, or wait a turn or 2 to summon a stronger monster. It does not cost summoning power when playing spells or traps. You're able to view how many monsters and spells and traps you have on the field, as well as the amount of cards in your deck and your summoning power. Your opponent's information besides the amount of cards in their deck will always be occluded. Fusion summoning is a staple feature in the card game, but is remixed here to make it a lot more versatile and common. You can choose to overlay monsters in your hand. Doing so will either fuse the monsters if they're compatible, or destroy/discard a monster if they're not. Sort of like modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, several combinations of monsters can end up making the same monster. One that was very useful to me was fusing a zombie monster and a plant monster to make Pumpkin, the King of Ghosts. However, it doesn't work with just any zombie or plant, but I'd be lying if I said I knew what the exact criteria was to make Pumpkin. It's also probably important to mention that most monsters that are made from fusions aren't exclusive to it. I could have won a copy of Pumpkin from Bones if I kept beating him, but instead was satisfied with fusing. This overlay mechanic is also how you equip spells on monsters. Alternatively, you could simply move the cards into each other on the board to attempt a fusion or power up with an equipped spell. Attempting to move a card over an incompatible spell or trap will simply destroy the non-moving card. If an incompatible spell or trap attempts to move into a monster card, the spell or trap will always be destroyed. There's also a rare mechanic called the Destiny Draw that will give you a card that the game believes will get you out of a desperate situation regardless if it's in your deck or not. This event can occur randomly once per duel. Spellbinding is an important tool when traversing the board. Under certain circumstances, cards can be spellbound, meaning that they're frozen in place for a predetermined amount of turns. You'll typically either see this happen for 1, 3, or forever. This effect is commonly seen on trap cards and some monsters. This is also an area where attributes are important. If two monsters battle and the winning monster's attribute has an advantage over the losing monster's attribute, then the attacking monster will be spellbound immediately after the battle for 1 turn. This system is pretty simple in that each attribute spellbinds and is spellbound by 1 attribute each. Light is spellbound by dark, which is S-speed by wind, which is S-speed by earth, which is S-speed by fire, which is S-speed by water, which completes the loop by being spellbound by light. It's probably important to mention here that a full turn is when both players have had the chance to go, not just one. Each duel lasts a maximum of 99 turns. If a duel happens to go on this long, then the winner will be the duelist with the most life points. So stalling for the entire duel is a viable strategy if you don't care about each match taking over an hour. The last mechanic I want to talk about is one of my favorites, being the game's big focus on terrain. Taking a page out of the Wild West rulebook that was Duelist Kingdom, the terrain your monsters battle and move around on can be crucial to winning a game. Much like spellbinding being intertwined with attributes, terrain's pros and cons are determined by the type a monster is. If a monster is on a tile of terrain that benefits them, they'll receive a 500 boost to their attack and defense, and increase their face-up movement potential by letting the monsters move up to 2 tiles in a turn instead of 1. A monster that is disadvantaged by terrain will usually just receive a 500 attack and defense decrease penalty until they move off the terrain. Battles always take place in the defending monster space, which is important to keep in mind. The terrain spaces are as follows. Normal is completely neutral, not benefiting or hindering any type of monster. Dark, forest, meadow, mountain, sea, and wasteland all have types that they give advantages and disadvantages to. For the sake of not giving information overload, I'm not going to list them all. As an example though, mountain benefits dragon, fairy, thunder, and winged beast monsters while hindering zombies. The terrains I just mentioned all have field spell cards that can convert up to 13 spaces into that terrain. There are 3 other terrains that act less like the others. The Toon terrain is the most like the others, except that it powers up an arbitrary list of monsters that fall under the Toon moniker. Toon is not an official type, but thankfully any monsters that benefit from it have it listed in the detail of that card. Basically though, if it's used by Pegasus, it's probably strong in Toon. Crush is very interesting, taking inspiration from the Crush card Virus Trap card, letting monsters with less than 1500 attack and defense safely pass through it, while automatically destroying any monsters with stats higher than that. This is where Immortal monsters shine, as they not only receive the normal stat and movement boost, but they are also unaffected by Crush's 1500 restriction, and even turn terrain they're defeated on into Crush. Lastly is Labyrinth, which mostly serves as a blocker, making it so cards cannot move through it and being unable to be converted by field spells. There are a handful of cards that can move on Labyrinth or transform it, but the list is pretty small. One of the biggest forms of expression in not just this game, but Yu-Gi-Oh as a whole, is building your deck. Brought over from the card game is that you can only have up to 3 copies of a specific card in your deck. There are no restrictions on how many monsters, spells, or traps you have, so long as the total amount of cards is equal to 40. This game does put a few restrictions on you, but all of them make sense for this game. Like I mentioned earlier, you must have 40 cards, no more, no less, and not including your deck leader. Secondly, as a way of balancing the game, each card is given a value called deck cost. The cost of each card in your deck is added up, and the total is the numerical power of your deck. You can make your deck cost as high as you want, but that comes with a restriction since you cannot duel any opponents with a lower deck cost than you. You may find times throughout the game where you have to intentionally put less desirable cards in your deck just to be able to face duelists like Bones or a Shizu. Thankfully, some of the potential frustration from this is mitigated by being able to have 3 different decks saved at a time. There are technically 3 ways you can go about obtaining new cards. The main one is that each time you win a duel, you'll be presented with a 3-column slot machine filled with cards that were in the opponent's graveyard at the end of the duel, plus their deck leader. You can attempt to time the 3 button inputs to try to get the cards you want. I couldn't tell if it was hard to get the timing down or if I just suffer from a king of games issue. Getting 2 of the same card will unfortunately only result in 1 copy of that card. Getting 3 of the same card will net 1 copy of that card plus a bonus card. If the opponent didn't have enough cards in their graveyard, the game will instead fill those empty slots with the card Fake Trap, which kinda sucks. The other main method is called Reincarnation. Every 5 duels, no matter if you win or lose them, you can trade in one of your used cards to receive 3 cards that have around the same deck cost. The last method is the one that is mostly unintentional. By pressing the left stick, or L3 as the PlayStationers call it, in the deck edit menu, you are prompted to enter an 8-character password. Entering specific passwords will grant you 1 copy of a specific card. I say mostly unintentional because only 34 of these passwords were officially distributed, with the remaining 820 being found through data mining. It's up to you to decide if you want to seek these out, but I feel it is important info that you could only use each password once, so even if you wanted 3 copies of a card, you'd have to obtain the other 2 more legitimately. I personally only use 1 official password that is given to you at the end of the White Rose story, and 3 non-distributed ones. 2 of those being used after I completed the first side of the story, and the last being after I was done playing entirely. At the beginning of the game, right after you've chosen your name, you're presented with 3 starter decks and told to choose one. These 3 decks are chosen from a pool of 17. The decks chosen are not random and are dependent on your name. I looked out and got one of the 3 decks I was interested in, being Twin-Headed Behemoth. Although if I hadn't got the choice for any of them, I would have probably just tried playing with the name Rogue instead. Before choosing your deck, you're shown the deck leader, the average summon cost, and the main attributes and types the deck consists of. If you ever want to change your deck leader, the process is something I feel the game doesn't really explain. Basically, every monster you use has a military rank tied to it, starting at non-commissioned officer all the way up to Secretary of Defense, with there being 13 ranks total. Monsters rank up by earning experience points during duels. They gain XP by defeating other monsters, surviving attacks, and being on your field at the end of the turn. However, they can also lose XP by being sent to the graveyard, which could possibly lead to them being demoted a rank. Thankfully, once monsters rank up to the 2nd rank, being 2nd Lieutenant, they cannot be demoted back to an NCO. Deck leaders also gain and lose XP, which is determined by winning and losing duels. Unfortunately, there's no way to see how much experience your monster has. Thankfully though, the game will at least tell you when they've been promoted, and you could always check what rank they are. Once a monster reaches 2nd Lieutenant, they can become your deck leader, which at that point is just as simple as adding any other card to your deck. As your deck leader ranks up, they'll gain new abilities like the ability to have damage, power up nearby ally monsters, gain 50 life points each turn, and so on. There's even an ability called Find that rewards you with a secret card hidden on a tile in each duel. Unfortunately, I didn't get to use any of those abilities because from my experience, ranking up was far too slow. The highest rank any of my monsters ever achieved was 1st Lieutenant, which is only the 3rd rank. To put that into perspective, that means that by the time I stopped playing, the most XP any of my monsters had was 1999. The highest rank requires 65,535. If you ever want to take a break from the story mode, you can always play the custom duel mode. This mode lets you face off against either a handful of AI opponents, each with a different deck, or another person using local co-op. I'm not sure why you would when you could see each other's cards, but who am I to judge? Going back to the AI opponents though, there's 4 potential opponents you can face. The way you go about dueling each one is kind of strange though, being dependent on the status of your second memory card slot. Deckmaster S, which primarily uses a plant deck, can be fought if you have a second memory card inserted that does not contain Duelist of the Roses save data. Deckmaster T uses the unstoppable Exodia, with its duel requirement being a PS1 memory card in the second slot. Deckmaster I uses immortal monsters and requires a pocket station in your second memory card slot, which I had never heard of before making this video. But it was only released in Japan, so no Master I for us, I guess. The last and most useful of opponents in my opinion is Deckmaster K, who uses an exact copy of the player's deck. The reason this is useful is because you still earn cards from winning duels, meaning that you can get additional copies of cards you already have. Thankfully, the requirements to battle Master K is to not have anything inserted into the second memory card slot. The other draw of Custom Duel is the ability to duel on exclusive fields not seen in single player. Also, the ability to make your own custom fields. You have complete freedom when making a field, being able to place any terrain on any tile. This is such a great idea and would have thrived if this game was made in the age of online multiplayer. The last non-single player feature is the ability to trade cards between memory cards, which is a neat little addition. Throughout my several playthroughs over the years, I usually gravitate towards the same deck every time, that being Birdface. However, this time I wanted to try something different. After looking through all 17 decks, there were 3 that I wanted to try out: Molten Behemoth, Robotic Knight, or Twin-Headed Behemoth. I ended up getting lucky being able to choose Twin-Headed Behemoth, which mostly consisted of dragon monsters. This worked out especially well because my ultimate goal was to obtain a Curse of Dragon and Gaia the Fierce Knight so I could regularly fusion summon Gaia the Dragon Champion. To this day, Curse of Dragon and Dragon Champion are 2 of some of my favorite monsters. You can fusion summon to make Curse of Dragon by using a small pool of dragons and a decent pool of zombies, but I never managed to get the monsters I needed to make it and have it be worth it, so I didn't get to use Curse of Dragon until I entered its password. In the meantime, I had a few go-to monsters that consistently won me games or got me out of tight spaces. Kaiser Dragon, who stayed with me from beginning to end, was great throughout. Early on, I would sometimes even fuse it with Thunder Dragon to make Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon, which is incredibly powerful in this game since not many monsters at this point had over 2,500 attack points. The last monster I want to mention before the true stars of the show is Pumpkin, the King of Ghosts. This monster has decent attack and defense, but its main draw is powering up all zombie monsters on the field, including itself, by 100 each turn that it's in face-up defense mode. This made it a great defensive tool, defending me all the while slowly powering up, eventually sending it out to take out huge threats. Funnily enough, I didn't have a copy until after the last duel I played. I was able to consistently make one by fusing a plant and a zombie monster. Lastly, I want to talk about Gaia the Dragon Champion and the 2 monsters needed to make it. As far as I know, unlike other cards that can be made through fusing, you cannot obtain a copy of Dragon Champion itself. Therefore, my ultimate goal was to get Curse of Dragon, have it get promoted, and make it my deck leader. Curse has an interesting effect, making it whatever terrain it battles on wasteland, which sucks if that terrain was originally mountain, but great if it was battling any kind of water monster. Gaia the Fierce Knight really pulled me through any duel that contained meadow. I unfortunately didn't get to use Gaia the Dragon Champion much since I was more focused on promoting Curse of Dragon, but the few times I did, it did very well. Out of the monsters I just mentioned, all of them besides Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon got promoted at least once, plus my first deck leader Twin-Headed Behemoth did as well. Overall, while the cards in my deck changed quite a bit, my general strategy was to comprise my deck of both higher level monsters and low level monsters, either to fuse into higher level monsters or for their useful effects. Dragons were pretty much the main focus, while being rounded out by a few other types as well. This game's difficulty is going to be really hard to put into words. There are so many factors that it's difficult to convey a concrete level of challenge. I played this game countless times and it still didn't go easy on me. From my experience, it seems like whichever story you start with will be the more challenging one due to your deck being new and relatively weaker compared to what it will probably be once you start the other story. I started out by siding with the Red Roses. This game keeps track of your wins and losses and displays it on the world map. By the time I beat both stories, I had 21 wins and 4 losses. Those 4 losses all came from facing White Roses. Once to Bandit Keith, once to the Labyrinth Ruler, once to Pegasus, and once to the Nightmare Guy. I continued playing after beating both stories because I wanted to complete Curse of Dragon's story, and ended at 32 wins and 7 losses, because rematching the White Rose Nightmare Guy was not easy despite his deck not changing at all. I think that as you progress through the game, learn how the game works, and develop strategies, it should get more fun as a result. Once I started to understand what the AI would and wouldn't do, it became easier to predict while still not being a cakewalk. The game has a tutorial that does a pretty good job with getting you prepared and takes around 20 to 30 minutes. Honestly, my one gripe with this game is that there isn't more of it for me to play. Once you finish the stories, you're basically done unless you want to win a specific card. I wish that maybe after you completed both stories, you could unlock the ability to rematch more difficult versions of all of your previous opponents. Either way, I ended up spending about 15 to 16 hours total replaying this game, although 6 of those hours were after both stories were completed. In terms of graphics, Duelist of the Roses looks just as well as any other game released on the PS2 or Xbox. The game has a surprising amount of fanfare for a game about moving cards around, which I think is fantastic. There are animated effects for lots of spells and traps. Monsters will even appear over their own cards if they're face up. This game also has 3D animated battles between the monsters, increasing the spectacle tenfold. The battles will even take place in a 3D environment of the terrain you're currently on. Each monster has their own attack and death animation, while some even have an animation celebrating their victory. You can view the models of monsters you own by pressing triangle in the deck edit menu. As a quick aside, seeing these monsters in 3D made me realize there are a handful of monsters that are just palette swaps of other monsters. You can find several examples of these in the game yourself, but the ones I immediately noticed were Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon and Two-Mouthed Dark Ruler, and Crawling Dragon number 2 and Bee Dragon Jungle King. This isn't Duelist of the Roses' fault, as the cards already existed in the real-life card game beforehand, and I don't even think it's really a problem at all. I just found it interesting that it took me until recently to notice. Unfortunately, the cards aren't exactly correct, as they all just have some placeholder text you can't read, but that's such a non-issue. The soundtrack is pretty nice to listen to, but isn't anything to really write home about. Except for the absolute banger that is the intro to this game. I'm not kidding when I say that the intro movie to this game when you boot it up is one of, if not the best video game opening there is. The music is fantastic. It shows you what to expect while looking super exciting. Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses was released in North America in 2003 exclusively on the PlayStation 2. Unfortunately, this game was never re-released or even made backwards compatible for later PlayStation systems. If you really want this game, then you could find it on sites like Amazon and eBay for as low as $25 USD. Personally, I would only recommend this option if you already have a PS2 and are interested in the game. Otherwise, I just straight up recommend you play this game through an emulator. I know I usually beat around the bush when it comes to emulation, but this game is unlikely to ever be re-released or remastered at this point, and it just isn't worth it to seek out an over 2-decade-old console just for one game. As a small tidbit though, PS2 emulation isn't as refined as the big game company in Japan's consoles are, so things aren't going to be 100% perfect. For this game specifically, there is a bug where the camera is supposed to zoom in on the cards for a second or two when they interact on the field. However, when playing on an emulator, it'll instead zoom too far into the field. Someone did actually create a patch that is very easy to implement, although it has the slight side effect that whenever there's a bird's eye view of the field, which is usually only when a duel is starting, or you're using the field editor, the camera will be rotated slightly. Also, early Yu-Gi-Oh! Games had the tradition of including specific real-life cards as a purchase bonus. Buying this game nets you Alpha, Beta, and Gamma the Magnet Warrior. Funnily enough, the Magnet Warriors are probably my favorite cards in all of Yu-Gi-Oh!, so this was a sweet deal for me. You'd be hard-pressed to find copies of the game that include these cards and is a reasonable price at the same time. But thankfully you can get the cards individually in good condition from sites like TCG Player for only a few dollars each. Before making this video, I hadn't played Duelist of the Roses in at least 10 years. Coming back to it hit me with a wave of nostalgia, welcoming me back with open arms. This is such a unique and incredibly fun spin on the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise that I wish was either remastered for modern consoles or given a long-awaited sequel. If you have any interest in Yu-Gi-Oh, I highly recommend giving this a try. With that said, I'm going to place Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist of the Roses in the number 3 slot between Amazing Mirror and FRLG. The only negative feeling I had coming out of this game was that there wasn't more of it, which is usually not a bad feeling at all. I could definitely see myself coming back to this game every time I go through a Yu-Gi-Oh kick. Thank you all so much for watching. Have you heard of Duelist of the Roses before? Whether that's a yes or a no, did I make you want to play it? Please let me know whatever it is that you think in the comments, and if you wouldn't mind leaving a like on the video if you enjoyed it. It means so much seeing how positive my videos are being received, so thank you all for the feedback you give. I'm already almost just 10 subscribers away from 50, which I didn't expect at this point whatsoever. Thanks again, and I hope to see you again soon!